Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today we are here with an installment of recent reads. So I'm going to be giving small reviews on the books that I've read recently, of course. This is just following my monthly favorites, so these books were mentioned very briefly there, but I wanted to elaborate a little bit more, elucidate for anybody who was curious about those books. So we have a wide variety. So there's one tarot book, one novel, one magic related book, and one that's sort of a historical text. So we have a nice diverse group, I would say, in terms of the types of literature going on today. So I'll start, as I'm like going down to dive for the books, I will start with or go in the order in which I finished them. I read them all within this past month of August, so I'll start with what I finished first and then work in that fashion, if that makes any sense. So chronologically. So the first one that we have here, and this one was sent to me for review by the author, so thank you so much, Alex. This is Pop Magic, A Simple Guide to Bending Your Reality. And the author is Alex Kazemi. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, I'm trying my best. And there's a foreword by Rose McGowan, another one that could go either way. So this is a really nice book. I'd seen it in Barnes & Noble, and had debated getting it for myself, and then it just so happened that Alex reached out and I was really thankful. So for me, this was a particularly interesting read. I really enjoyed it. I'll start by saying that. It was different from the types of magical texts and literature that I tend to seek out for myself, so I appreciated it sort of breaking the mold that I'd put myself within, or the confines that I kind of created for myself. It's always nice to have your boundaries pushed or to be offered something that's a little bit outside of your norm. And it really, I think for me, is like a timepiece. So the way that it draws in pop culture and examines very modern uses and possibilities in terms of magic that I don't think were so prevalent in previous generations was very, very interesting. So I love how there are references to, for example, pop culture. I think that this book is best suited for those that are either Gen Z or late millennial. I'm kind of on the cusp. I'm kind of just, I think, on the side of millennial. It varies based on where the cutoff is thought to be, but I think it's great for people within that area. I also think it's greater for older generations if they're looking to get a sense of, I would say, younger magical practitioners. So I personally think it's very interesting to examine generations prior and their sorts of practices and ideologies, as well as the incoming and newer and younger generations. I don't think either has more weight or validity, but I do think it's nice to understand the spectrum of everybody within our magical community, of all backgrounds, of all ages, so on and so forth. And I think that this book gives a perspective that is much needed in that way. It also discusses topics that might be considered a little bit, I would say, racy or touchy for generations prior. Things like, for example, sex magic, which I know is becoming more prevalent now, or being spoken about, at least more prevalency now. And so those sorts of things I think are very interesting to include, especially as this could be a sort of a primer for a beginner in a way. The way that manifestation is spoken about, and the way that there's this sort of formless, nothing is quite wrong sort of attitude to the way magic is approached, I think is a very new concept. It's a valuable concept, but new. And for that reason, I found this to be very interesting. And when I, for example, disagreed with something, it made me re-examine why it is I disagree with it. So I like books that push me in that way, that kind of touch those buttons that you really need to investigate, the things that you kind of try to avoid and slough off and ignore. That's what this book was really valuable for me in. So when I found myself confronted with something that I either disagreed with or found potentially unsavory, it was a moment for me to reflect and turn inward and uncover the sort of shadow that represented in me. Was I being a bit of an elitist? Was I being too traditional and structured and rigid in trying to adhere to tradition in a way, and how do I break free from that? What value does this sort of, I almost want to call it devil may care attitude to magic, what does this represent? What value does it bring to the table? And I think that there is value in it, of course, and for that reason I really enjoyed it. It's very, I wouldn't say it's a quick read. It is on the quick read sort of side, so this is the kind that you could pick up and put down very easily. You don't need to necessarily allocate big chunks of time for focus and study. This is the kind of book that I would keep on my coffee table and encourage anybody to maybe flip through and find something that it stands out to them within it. Something that I found was very easy for me to kind of, okay, pick up, and the chapters are on the shorter side, so you could read a quick chapter, put it down, go about your day, return to it when you get a chance. So I enjoyed it in that way. There's things on elemental magic, meditation, manifestation, working with various beings. There's also a lot of anecdotes that are very pop culture influenced, and in that way you get a good taste of the author's background, and that was really valuable for me because I always want to understand where a writer's coming from when they produce or create anything. So I found that to be really invaluable. It's almost like a timepiece, and I imagine this being something that will be very interesting to reflect on maybe 20 years from now and to get a sense of what was happening in the here and now. So I really enjoyed this. It was a great read, and it was a different read for me, which is partially why I enjoyed it so much. Moving right along, next we have Tarot of the Spirit. Is this just, yeah, Tarot of the Spirit, Companion to the Tarot deck, painted by Joyce Eakins, and the book is by Pamela Eakins. So mother-daughter team of the Tarot of the Spirit deck. And this is just the basic guidebook that comes separately from the deck, of course. It's a bit of a chunky guidebook. I want to say it's about 400 pages. It's pretty dense, I will say. This is not a quick read by my standards, at least. There's a lot of draw from free-flowing spirituality, from esoteric, astute knowledge, and a meditative, poetic flow. So this is where I think very structured and esoteric systems like the Thoth and free-flowing, more artistic styles that I think are more modern, at least in divination, as far as I know. That's where I think this is a great intersection for that. I think this is very well researched, and there's a lot of knowledge present here. So I know that Pamela Eakins is the primary creator, as in she offered the ideas and set about the creation of the deck, and her mother, Joyce Eakins, was the artist of Tarot of the Spirit. So Pamela Eakins has a background in many sorts of religious and theological, spiritual practices. So I know she followed a Buddhist path for quite some time. She studied childbirth in a very spiritual way. She has a business aspect to her background as well, along with a bunch of other studies where I think she studied and mentored, had a mentor who was a magical practitioner of a witch of some sort, I should say. So there's a lot that went into this. You can kind of see the bits of the various practices she draws from present within this book. So we do get a lot of that Buddhist acceptance and path or road to enlightenment and non-attachment. And so that's really interesting, just as somebody who's not as familiar with Buddhism, who knows maybe the bare minimum. So it was interesting for me to get a taste of that. She's clearly well read on the Kabbalah as well. There's a lot of reference to the Kabbalah in this, and the Tree of Life, and all that entails. And I think that the deck was made centered around the Kabbalah. Well, I know that that is the case, just in that the newer versions of the deck come with a transparent Tree of Life card that you can overlay on top of the tarot cards, and apparently the various Sephira and paths were kept in mind in the placement of various symbols within the card, and those are referenced. There are meditations for each card, so the first chunk of the book goes into working with the tarot, what it can mean, why you're using it as a tool for spiritual development, where it is that you're trying to head in life as a soul. I think it's very non-denominational in that this could work for many different spiritual paths and practices, and work for many different practitioners of various types. So that's really interesting as well. But then we get a little bit into the Kabbalah, we get into the more nitty-gritty knowledge, which I found to be very interesting from Pamela, Pamela Eakin's perspective. She has a lot to offer. There are meditations to be done with each card. It's seen as a journey, really, I think. It goes through the minors first, and the majors are saved for last. And there's just such a wealth of knowledge present here that I found myself so immersed within this book and curious I would almost read this if I wasn't a tarot reader, if I wasn't interested in the deck at all, and I think that there'd still be something to gain. Reading it from front to back, this is one of those guidebooks I think you can most definitely do that. It's almost like each card is a small chapter of its own, and there's a little world that's almost created. So you get a meditation, you get a poem, you get the breakdown of the symbology within the card, but you also get this it almost felt like an artistic essay on each card as its main sort of portion of writing. And so for that, I highly, highly enjoy this. This is, I think, one of my favorite tarot books I've read to date, just in that it broke the mold a little bit. And I think the creative aspect and the way that it got me thinking and feeling was new. It was new, and I hadn't had a tarot book do that to me in the past. And so I would highly recommend this book if you're in the market and you are looking to maybe read up on Tarot of the Spirit, which is a system and deck that I thoroughly enjoy, so I recommend checking that out as well. Small coffee break. So moving right along, as I wipe the condensation off, we have a novel, and this is Angel Mage by Garth Nix. It's a YA fantasy novel, or a young adult fantasy novel. I haven't read a good novel, or haven't really read many novels in recent weeks, so it was nice to be able to get back into the novel sort of swing. That's really where a lot of my love for reading came from. That's where it was derived from, and as a kid I would just blaze through novels. The same can be said now. I find that it's very easy for me to get through a novel very quickly. I don't have to really apply any discipline like I would, say, with a tarot book and tell myself or kind of push myself to get through it. This is the kind of thing I would pick up for fun, and I would be excited to read, so I would kind of bide my time while I'm doing my work and waiting to read this book. So Garth Nix, I believe that this author has other young adult books out, or novels, that I may have read at some point. I can't remember. I know that they have other books that are in reference to this series on various angels, I believe, or I could be wrong, but from what I could see on the shelves and what I kind of gleaned, they have other books on angels and this sort of fantasy genre of angelic magic. Now, this is a bigger book. I believe it's about 500 pages, and there's a lot of world building present here. So as is the case with many fantasy novels, you get a whole new geography, there's new cultures, there's new sorts of languages and names. So there's a lot of cultural background that's built up. You do get maps towards the beginning of the various places that are prevalent or heavily referenced within the book. So if you want to reference these sorts of maps of places that are spoken about, and they refer to the various geographical features and street names and all of that. And so if you are, I know that there's kind of two sides to people who read fantasy books. Some really enjoy the world building and some don't, and I think you have to be in the right headspace and really enjoy an author creating something and taking the time to craft the world. And for some people that's just not their cup of tea. For me it really is, and I will take the time to reread sections so that I get a better understanding of the various nuances, and so that's something I actually really enjoy. This book flips perspective quite a bit, so you start with a sort of third-party perspective that's in the past, but you sort of flip between the antagonist and the sort of band of friends who are the protagonists. So there are about four. There are four basically protagonists, and you actually start with the perspective of the antagonist, who's really a little bit more of the shining star of the book, so to speak. And it was interesting. I love when the villain or antagonist is featured and you get their perspective, because you start to see where they're coming from. If it's done well, you start to sympathize with them and see that there's some sort of validity or truth within their scheme, that there's a method to their madness, that it's not just this senseless evil act, that there's something to it. And I enjoyed that, and I actually loved the villain or antagonist. Her name, I believe, is Lilia. So the names and the cultures and stuff are heavily based around, of course, a lot of angels are referenced, so they will, I don't believe any of the angels' names are the same as the angels that I know from, say, the Kabbalah or traditional angel names, but they're very similarly structured. And from what I can gather, it seems almost like this is taking place in North Africa or the Middle East, so that range where maybe Christianity was sort of derived from, if that makes any sense. Like, I can almost imagine this taking place in way back when, the Fertile Crescent, that sort of geographical area, and the way that people are referenced. So I liked that there was sort of a diversity in this. The majority of characters are not described as white, actually, and there's a very natural diversity in what seems like the makeup of characters, and also the way that, for example, sexuality is referenced in a very fluid and open way with no sort of discrimination or judgment. Same for body types and shapes, for skin tones and backgrounds. And so for that fact, the way that it was just integrated so seamlessly and naturally was, I think, really beautiful, and I'd love to see a lot of novels and fantasy books, and especially young adult books going in this direction, because I know that that's a relatively new thing for even just the young adult genre to be present. There wasn't really much of a young adult genre going back like 20 years, but I think it's important that young people are able to see themselves in books, because it's such a formative period, and if you feel isolated and you're turning to a book, which is, I think, what I did a lot as a child. So yeah, if you're using the book as a sort of escape and you're looking to see yourself reflected within it, I think it's important to have diversity in the types of people being represented, so that those turning to books who are in those formative periods feel represented, and I enjoyed it for that fact. Now, I loved the sort of world building around the ideas of angelic magic and what that entailed, and there was a lot of attention to detail. Nothing was left out, and there were no major plot holes that I could find, or holes in the way that the world was built. So sometimes there's these big gaps and you're like, well, that's not explained very well, or that could easily be overwritten by that. All of it's explained very thoroughly, which I enjoy, because I'm the kind of person that's mentally picking at what the world is, trying to find holes in it, and trying to almost see if it meets a certain standard of attention to detail and thought. And this definitely passed that test for me. The way that angelic magic is performed is extremely interesting. It's almost like there's sort of icons of various sorts, whether they're jewelry or statues or brooches or paintings, and individuals can call upon them. So the technology isn't really present in the society at a high degree, but they have a lot of modern amenities and medicines because of angelic magic, and that's how they sort of solve all their problems. Of course, not of course, but one of the big impetuses for what's happening here is that a big region of the world sort of had this downfall when an archangel fell from grace in a way, or was ousted, and that created a sort of plague which formed this sort of group, and there's a lot going on within the world. But the characters are so interesting. There's a diversity in the types of, I would say, the way that the characters, they have their own distinct voice, and I liked that. So we have the antagonist, the villain, and where she's coming from, and she's a little bit more self-centered and powerful and confident, and then we have one of the protagonists who's a little bit meek. He's a meek sort of guy, and he doesn't have all his shit together, and he's kind of confused, but he has his skill set. There's one girl who's kind of off in the clouds, but she's extremely intelligent. We get more of that brawny, straightforward sort of guy, and then we get the girl who tries to be the leader. So there's just like, everybody's represented. They all felt very distinct. They weren't blending together. I find that when there are books where we get the perspectives of a lot of characters throughout, that sometimes they can blend together if it's not done very well. That was not the case here. There's a really long exposition, and then it gets really quick at the end, but overall I would say it's very action-packed. There's a lot of fight scenes, there's a lot of sort of mental games going on that you are privy to that maybe not all of the characters are, and so if you're interested in that sort of fast-paced intrigue, world-building, magic, with a lot of different perspectives and things to investigate, I would highly recommend this. I really loved it, it was a nice refreshing novel after a long span of not having read a novel. So highly recommend. And if I remember correctly and have read other books by this author, which I believe I have when I was younger, that I recommend their other books as well. So now moving into the final book being mentioned, we have the Book of Enoch the Prophet. I always want to read that in the reverse order. So the Book of Enoch the Prophet, this version is written by R.H. Charles with an introduction by R.A. Gilbert and a new introduction by Milo Duquette. I think we're all, or most of us, are familiar with Milo Duquette. That's part of why I picked this specific translation. He sort of vetted it within his introduction. There's a lot of attention to detail in the foreword and the introduction as to what sets this translation apart from others. There's a key with that helps you to see very distinct, if I can just show this properly, aspects of this translation. So there's little symbols allocated for, say, when the author added something, or when a word was sort of taken with some liberty, or when, say, an aspect was specifically translated from an Ethiopian version. They really take the time to let you know where they're coming from and how it was translated, and the attention to detail. And as Milo Duquette mentioned, he's read a few various translations and he happened to like this one the best, which is why he was willing to write the introduction. So considering he's quite knowledgeable and that he has read various translations and then decided that this was a superior one, I decided that the same was the case. So I might check out other translations. I'm not too much of a stickler. I think if this became a very big mainstay in my practice and something I was referencing often, I would care a lot about the translation. But as this was a first read through, I don't think it will affect or has affected my experience too much. So, of course, it's the book of Enoch the Prophet. Wow. So, as some of you may know, within Christianity or within the Bible, or I believe the Torah as well, there are various books, and what really sets, or not, I mean, a part of what sets different sects of Christianity and Abrahamic religions apart is what books of these sorts of tomes they choose to include. So some will omit or keep out or not reference certain books and potentially even see them as heretical or irrelevant or counterproductive to their paradigm. So one maybe Protestant, the various Protestant sects of Christianity include certain books, so you'll find Bibles of that sort. Catholicism will include certain books, but not others as well. So you get this sort of division of these various books that are being tossed around and included within these Abrahamic religions. And many Abrahamic religions and sects of Christianity don't reference the Book of Enoch the Prophet. It's seen as something that's a bit unsavory in a way. And so Enoch was a prophet who basically, in short, ascended to heaven body and soul. So he never had to die, just as, for example, if you look at Jesus did have to die or did die and then ascended, or kind of, that's complicated actually. But Enoch ascended body and soul very, very blatantly and clearly. And within the Book of Enoch the Prophet, there's a lot that's gone into about the structuring of angels and demons, the hierarchies, their roles, how they influenced humanity, and in what ways they adversely apparently influenced humanity, and the fall of various angels for having done certain things. And Enoch really just investigating and being privy to a lot of the inside scoop of what's what, and him being, I guess, seen as more worthy or good or righteous, and for that reason he's able to connect and communicate with the angels, and eventually he ascends to heaven body and soul and is seen as worthy. And there's a lot within the sort of text that I find very magically scintillating in a way, especially as I'm studying the Bible and angelic magic and sort of just cherry-picking aspects from Christianity and Catholicism that I want within my magical practice. This felt very pertinent and helpful, and I really enjoyed it for that. So even if you're not very interested in Christianity or Catholicism, I would almost say that there's something rebellious about this book specifically, and that there's a reason that many sects of Christianity don't recognize it. So take that for what you will. I found it to be extremely interesting, and I think I'm going to reread it and reference it for time to come. So I enjoyed it in that way. So this specific version looks like this. I got it at Barnes & Noble. I already mentioned the various authors. So that brings us through my recent reads, books that I read in the month of August. It was a decent month for reading, and I really enjoyed all of the books that I had the opportunity to read and the sorts of differences. So we had novels, we had tarot, we had magic, we had more historically based texts, and I like having that sort of mix up of the various types of books going on. So let me know what you thought. Let me know what you've been reading, all of you out there. Like and subscribe if this was fun, helpful, interesting. If you've read these books, I'd be curious to know what you think as well. I hope you are all well, and until next time, bye.